recording. So welcome to our May monthly meeting. Pete's not here tonight. He's actually white water rafting with some friends, so that's fun. We have Kris here to talk about lasagna gardening, part 2 with warm crops, and she'll also talk a little bit about tomato plants, right, Kris?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay, cool.
So last time, we talked about cool weather crops, and we talked about how we have like 3 separate kind of growing areas, growing times in this climate. We can plant cool weather crops pretty early in the spring. Now is the time that we plant warmer weather crops. And then later in the late summer, early fall, we can plant the cool weather crops again and be able to harvest them before the last frost. So we talked about the cool weather crops. Now we're going into the warmer weather crops. So we are past the last frost date. So it's pretty much safe now to plant almost anything. Well, anything. So you can plant tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and tomatillo starts now. You can plant beans, pole beans, and bush beans. You can plant cucumbers, summer squash, and winter squash. And then some of the cool weather crops are kind of all season. So you could still be planting carrots and beets. Chard goes really well through all the seasons. So we're gonna talk about how to kind of transition your garden and how to make the most of the space in your garden by using succession planting. So our objectives tonight are we're going to talk about what succession planting means, give a nice definition and make sure everybody understands the concepts. We're going to talk about the benefits and also some of the drawbacks of succession planting. We'll talk about many different methods for succession planting, and then a little bit about how to plan for that. And I'll be giving some examples of the different methods along the way. So to start out with, succession planting is staggering plantings or planting quick maturing crops multiple times throughout the growing season. And succession planting results in a succession of harvests, hence the name succession planting, right? We get a long, continuous harvest throughout the whole season without getting too much of any one thing at one time. So some of the benefits are that it keeps the garden more productive by maximizing the space. When you use succession planting, you always have something growing in your garden and always have something ready to harvest. Succession planting staggers the harvest for a more manageable production and a more continuous supply of your fresh produce. It also, as I mentioned earlier, it keeps you from getting just a glut of any one thing at one time, more than you can use at one time. So it kind of helps you to manage your harvest so you don't have things that are going to waste in your garden. And it extends the growing and harvesting seasons because you always have something ready to harvest and something coming up along behind it, growing up along behind it, ready to take its place when the harvest is finished. And then another benefit is that it's adaptable to all growing plants. So whether you're planting in rows, whether you plant in patches or areas or wide rows, or beds, or whether you use the square foot gardening method or any other one, this succession planting can be used with any of those gardening techniques. Some of the drawbacks and challenges are that it can be difficult sometimes to maintain a continuous and consistent source of seeds and transplants. That's one of the things that requires a little bit of planning at the beginning of the season, because as you go through the season, the selection at the stores are less and you might not be able to find what you want. So you may have to plan ahead a little bit and pick up some extra seeds at the beginning of the season and keep your eye out for the transplants that you might need or grow your own. And then you might also have trouble sourcing other resources like soil amendments, because again, as we go through the season, the supply of things at the stores kind of wanes. And then the thinking and planning, it can seem a little burdensome maybe, but the way I look at it is if I front load all this planning at the beginning of the growing season, if I plan for how I'm going to manage my garden to make the most of the space, and I have that plan in place, then I just have to implement it during the season, and I don't have to do a lot of thinking about it as I go. So some of the methods for succession planting, one is called replanting after harvest, also called the harvest and sow method. And this is planting different vegetables in succession. So sometimes it's called the relay method, and it means you grow different vegetables in the same space throughout the growing season. And once you harvest an early crop, then you replace it with another crop of something else. So for example, if you planted peas early in the spring, when your peas are starting to wane, when the production is slowing down, you can cut them off at ground level, and you can plant cucumbers in that same place and use the trellis that you were using for your peas to grow your cucumbers up a trellis. So you're using that same space in your garden twice and getting a greater yield. One thing to remember about succession planting in this way is that it can tax the soil if you're putting two crops in the same spot. So always amend your soil in between your harvesting and removing one set of plants and planting the next one. Some crops with a shorter growing season can also be replaced by plants that have a long growing season. Like you could also replace something like peas or radishes with eggplants or tomatoes. You can put them in the same space. And I'm going to show you some graphics in a little while that will help. So another example would be if you plant carrots early in the spring, after your first harvest of carrots are out, the ground is empty, and you can replant with beans in the same spot. So I think you get the example. Once something is finished, rather than just pulling it out and leaving the ground bare, you can plant something right behind it. Another way to succession plant is to stagger plants and stagger your plantings. And so that would be plants that grow pretty quickly. Usually plants that take about 30 to 60 or maybe up to 75 days to mature. So let's say you have a packet of lettuce seeds, right? And there's a lot of little tiny seeds in a packet of lettuce seeds. And if you plant all those lettuce seeds on the same day, what's going to happen when it's time to harvest? You're going to have all that lettuce ready all at the same time. And unless you eat a lot of salad, you're going to have a lot of lettuce. You have the possibility of lettuce going to waste, right? Or your crop going to waste. But even if you're planting in a row, you can do this. You plant a section of your row with lettuce, and then about 10 days or 2 weeks later, plant another section, and continue to do that every 10 days or 2 weeks. Plant another section, or if you're using square foot, plant another square. And that way, when one section matures, you've got another section coming up behind it. And that will give you a continuous harvest without overflowing you with too much of one thing. This works really well for leafy crops and root crops, but also beans. Bush beans only take 75 days to mature. And we've got plenty of time between now, which is about when you do your first planting of beans, and the first frost to get in several plantings of beans. And then you won't be overwhelmed with too many beans at one time. So another way to stagger your harvest would be to plant the same plant with different maturity rates. So let's say you have tomatoes. You could plant an early season, a mid-season, and a late season tomato all at the same time, and then they would mature at different rates. Okay. And there are some other plants that are that way too. There are some like cabbages will do that. So you can, and potatoes. So you can look at the information about the plant that you're planting and see if there's an early, a mid, and a late season variety that can help you stagger your harvest. Another way to succession plant is to plant seeds and transplants together. So if you, again, we'll go back to lettuce. In the square foot gardening method, you plant 4 lettuces in 1 square foot. So if you planted 2 lettuce seeds and 2 lettuce transplants, those 2 transplants are going to be ready first, and then the seeds will come along behind. So again, you're staggering your harvest so that you're only producing a manageable amount that you can eat at the time. Transplanting the thinnings is also another way to succession plant. So look at something like, again, lettuce or spinach, not root crops. Root crops don't transplant well. Maybe even beans and peas. If you know, you've planted them, now they're growing, and some of them are too close together. If you can kind of carefully wiggle them out of the ground without disturbing the roots too much, you can take those and plant them in another part of your garden. They will take a little bit of time to recover from the shock of being pulled up and transplanted, so they will mature a little bit later than your original crop. And then also harvesting plants at different stages of development. So onions are a good example of this. And I talk from the square foot method because that's what I use, but it would apply to other types of planting methods as well. If you plant 9 onions in a square, that's how many you can hold, you could harvest 4 or 5 of them as green onions or scallions, and then you can allow the others to mature to their full size. You could even plant them closer together. You could even plant 16 onions in a square and then thin them out to 9 that you're going to let to grow to their full size. You know, you could do this with lettuce or spinach or arugula. You can plant them close together. You can harvest some of them as baby greens, and then you can let the rest mature to full heads. And then finally, another method would be to reserve some empty spaces in your garden to plan ahead for planting in the next season. This does leave you with some bare ground, but it allows you to save space and plan ahead for what's coming. Okay. Perfect. So this is sort of a square foot garden plan. This is a 4x4 foot bed that was planted early in the spring. So you can see that all the crops that are on there are pretty much our cool weather crops, right? And this is an example of leaving an empty space for something you're going to plant later. All right. And I'm going to show you what the next plan will look like after we go. But so all of these things, you know, they're here, and then something else is going to go here in the next season. So here's where we left that empty space in the spring, and the carrots that we plant that were here, they're still here, but then they put in a cherry tomato, a salad tomato, and a pepper in that space that was reserved. And now we've got another unplanted area here that can be planted with stuff for the fall. Yeah, everything else was already there. So they harvested this stuff here. They put in the tomatoes and peppers here where it was unplanted. And then they have this area ready for the next thing. And there is another plan like this that shows the fall garden. And shows what would have been planted here. So can you kind of get the picture that when something's finished, it doesn't mean your garden's finished. It means you just got an empty space and you've got the opportunity to add something else there instead. I will speak very briefly about tomatoes. I am not a tomato expert. So like I said, now is the good time to plant tomatoes. We're past our danger of frost. tomatoes can have some special requirements. And one of the things that Pete wanted me to talk about was pruning. So there are two ways that tomato plants grow. There is determinate and indeterminate. And the way that I remember it is indeterminate keeps growing forever. It's indeterminate how big that plant is going to get, right? So it's a vinier plant, and it continues to put out a few fruits at a time for a longer period of time. Determinate tomatoes grow to a determined height and then they stop. And they put out almost all their tomatoes at one time. So those are really good if you want to can, because you'll get most of your harvest in a smaller space of time. So it just depends on how you want your harvest. And also the indeterminate tomatoes will take up more room. So if you have a smaller garden, you might want to look for determinate varieties of tomatoes. One way that you can keep your indeterminate tomatoes kind of under control is by pruning. So tomatoes will put out what they call suckers, and the suckers grow right here between the main stem and a leaf. Okay, so if you can prune out the suckers so that you have just one stem without any side branches coming out, it'll have leaves coming out, but none of these little side branches. These little side branches only make leaves, and they won't produce fruit. And so if you leave them on your plant, you'll get a big bushy plant, but a lot of the energy will be going to that foliage instead of going to fruit production. So, so a good way to do it is to prune off the suckers at least to the bottom third of your plant. And you can even go up higher than that. If they're little like this, you can snip them with the snippers, or you can even pinch them with your thumb and fingernail. And it's not going to give you like more harvest, but it will give you a better harvest. You'll have better fruits, larger fruits, and healthier plants.
But also, while I have you there, what about rain splashing up on tomato plants? Is that, I've heard that causes a problem.
Yes, that can spread fungal diseases. So it is a good idea to have some kind of mulch around your tomatoes. So it could be straw, it could be shredded paper, it could be grass clippings, just something so there's not bare soil. It's so when the rainwater or even irrigation water, if you're watering with overhead sprinklers, hits the soil, then soil-borne pathogens can splash up onto the leaves and cause fungal diseases.
Okay, great. Good to know. Thanks, Kris.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I kind of follow that with anything that's 1 per square foot. I never put those plants right next to each other. There's always an empty square between. So whether it's broccoli or a pepper or eggplant or tomato or anything that's 1 per square foot, there's a empty square in between.
So I've had a lot of success from the last class we had. I printed off the Portland nursery thing, and I got started with my seeds. And so I feel like that's been going really good. I got spinach, cilantro, kale. I also actually narrowed down what I wanted to grow instead of trying to grow too much, which is usually, like overambitious. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pretty excited, and I think overall it's going well. One of the things I was just looking ahead, because one of the things I want to keep doing is the successions over the summer. So with my bed of spinach, can I expect that to bolt at some point this summer? And because I have probably the opposite of Jen, I have so much sun. I have probably almost my entire yard is full sun. including some afternoon sun a lot of times. So should I would it make sense to start some bean seeds in between my spinach now so that they'd be ready? Would that be the kind of thing I'd want to do?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, that would be a great idea. Cause yeah, spinach and lettuce and cilantro are gonna have to take a break during the hot weather. Yeah, so now would be the time you'd be following your cool weather crops with your warm weather crops.
Okay.
And then towards the end of July, early August, you'll start, as your warm weather crops start finishing up, then you can start putting in your cool weather crops again.
Yeah, that should be good. That's exciting.
We'll talk about that later in the summer.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Another one.
Yeah, Kitty.
Okay, so all of my chard is starting to bolt, and it's chard that was planted last year that came up again.
Mm-hmm.
So should I let this all go to seed, or should I try to save the seeds and replant, or what should I do? Because it's taking up, this is at my home garden, it's taking up 2 squares. And
I would take it out and replant.
Okay.
And I don't know that there's any benefit to saving seeds. I have a ton of chard seeds if you need chard seeds. But yeah, once it starts to bolt, it's like, yeah, just let it go. I mean, just take it out. It's done.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use cover crops throughout the year? And if so, what kind do you use?
I don't use cover crops because I just have fairly small beds, just 4 by 8 foot raised beds. And so I keep them planted during the growing season, and then I cover them with a layer of greens and then a layer of browns for the winter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
welcome.
everyone.
Nice seeing everyone.
Yeah, we'll get this recording out. I'll figure out how to do that. So
Yeah,
thanks.
send me the link, please.
For sure. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Hey, Juan.
Okay, bye.
All right, have a good night, everybody.